Divide and conquer. The old rule is being put into practice today by autocratic states. Some of them are conducting influence operations in other countries, but all of them are using disinformation and propaganda against their own citizens. Good evening, my name is Maia Mazurkiewicz, and welcome to the Anatomy of Disinformation. Today, when our most important source of information is the internet, running a successful campaign requires modern tools and techniques. But in some countries, disinformation is being used by states to polarize their citizens and keep their rulers in power. Have you ever thought of how your psychological processes can be exploited by people who want to manipulate you? Our first guest focuses on social and psychological processes in informational autocracies. Let's see what's happening in Hungary and other CEE countries.
Péter Krekó, director at Political Capital. He is currently the consortium leader for the Hungarian Digital Media Observatory, an anti-disinformation hub supported by the European Commission under the umbrella of the European Digital Media Observatory. He is member of the EDMO expert group on structural indicators for the Code of Practice on Disinformation. Péter is an associate professor in the Department of Social Psychology and the Disinformation and Artificial Intelligence Research Lab at Eötvös Loránd University of Sciences in Budapest.
Péter, welcome and thank you for joining the Anatomy of Disinformation, straight from Budapest.
And hi Maia, thanks for having me on the show.
Hello, great to have you. Especially that we are just entering 2025 and talking about the authoritarian regimes that you are specializing in. What is the specifics of the authoritarian playbook? Anything new for 2025?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's a broad one, but just very briefly, I would say that we previously had this old stereotype on the authoritarians and the dictators, that they are the old school guys, the technophobes, who have nothing to do with the technology. They can't even use their smartphones. They are just living in the old world and nostalgic about the past and so on. And I think what we can see as a novelty in the authoritarian playbook is that the new authoritarians are the most skillful and conscious users of technology, of modern technology, being it disinformation technology, being it some kind of creating artificial audiences on the social media, using artificial intelligence and so on. So, and also
how does it help them?
Yeah, it can help them because, as Sergei Guriev and Daniel Treisman says in their books, the modern dictators are some kind of spin dictators who want to spin the narrative and distort the information, and not just crack down on their opponents and use classic violent tools. So I think the authoritarian regimes are becoming a bit softer in the sense that there are less violence, more disinformation, but also they are becoming more efficient as they are using the technological tools in a much more attractive and much more successful manner.
So it's easier to control the crowds through the social media right now.
Yes, exactly. And I think it's also easier to have a strong impact on the approach and on the attitudes of the masses. We just have to remind ourselves that at the born of the totalitarian regimes at the 20th century, let's think about the Soviet Union or Mussolini's fascist state, the most developed communication tool that was available was the radio. And also there were cinema screenings. But right now we have much more developed technology. Let's think about social media. Let's think about mass surveillance. Let's think about wiretapping technology, artificial intelligence, and so on. And it just gives much more power in the hands of the autocrats. Of course, we are living in different environments.
Exactly. So let's go back maybe to the environment of Hungary. And what are the main narratives that you were seeing run by the government in your country?
I think what is interesting about Hungary is that in Hungary, you don't have these highly sophisticated technological tools to control the attitudes and the thinking of the masses. It's much more 20th century classical propaganda, where you have one message and it's spread all over across all the platforms possible. The most important narrative at the moment is an optimistic one, that the government wants to change the quite negative public mood with billboards that are saying that we have some good news. The good news are next year the economic figures will be better, that you will receive, we will keep your pensions and so on and so on. And the hope of the government is that they can just persuade the people without making any substantial measure that they are living in a good country that is prosperous. If we take a look at the statistics, though, in most of the living standard measures, Hungary is the worst or the second worst in the European Union. And for example, the purchase parity of the salaries is the second worst in the EU. Only Bulgaria is behind us. But I think this is also, to a different extent, a technique that is coming from the United States.
Make Hungary
great again. And also try to manipulate even the economic sentiments via disinformation measures. And the government thinks it will be hopeful. I think right now we are having a huge test of the regime for the simple reason that Viktor Orbán is not the most popular politician anymore. The leader of the opposition is more popular than him. And I think the informational autocracy that Orbán had built up in Hungary is facing a huge challenge at the moment. The elections are coming next year, so the battleground just becoming more intense.
So it's important to set the information space for the elections, but they're having similar tactics that, for example, are being used in Slovakia or Serbia, especially in terms of the media, right?
Yes, I think we have pointed out of similarities. Why we have to say as well that Orbán is on power for 15 years this year, 1.5 decade. He's the longest serving prime minister in the European Council at the moment. And it also means that if you want to take a grip on the media, you need time. It does not, you can't do it overnight. And so in Hungary, we can see the most centralized media landscape in the whole European Union, but I would say it's even more centralized. And I made some comparative research. So it's a factual based statement. It's more centralized than even in Serbia. I think the difference, the similarities between these countries is that there is a very similar narrative that is pushed in a very aggressive manner. And this is that the West is to blame for the war in Ukraine, that Russia wants a peace, Ukraine wants war, Brussels wants war. Previously, it was like that the United States also wants war. And in order to maintain peace, we have to cut all the funding and all the support towards Ukraine. I'm very curious how this narrative resonates right now, that we can see that Donald Trump is following quite different strategy and policies regarding the Kremlin than many expected.
So especially that Orbán was recently threatening of vetoing the sanctions in terms of the war for Russia, right?
Yes, exactly. What Orbán was threatening with is that it will veto the prolongation of the sanctions, which would immediately give a huge chunk of money to the Putin regime that they could put in the war machinery. To simplify it a bit, if it would have happened, then Russia could win the war, period. And but there was a phone call from Marco Rubio to the foreign minister of Hungary, Péter Krekó, on the preceding day before the vote on in the European Council on the sanctions. And it seems, even if it's not in the public record, but it seems that Marco Rubio was successful in persuading its Hungarian counterpart that it might be a better idea to keep on with the sanctions.
Péter, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Belarus presidential election is over. Nothing to see here. Move along. The report you're about to watch isn't your regular electoral postmortem with numbers and graphs. Instead, we'll find out how Alexander Lukashenko has been browbeating his citizens into voting for him for over 3 decades.
How do pro-government media in Belarus contribute to the preservation of the Lukashenko regime, especially in the context of the 2025 presidential elections?
Lukashenko's regime propaganda is threatening war in Ukraine before the presidential elections in Belarus, saying that if you want democracy, if you don't want Lukashenko, so there might be war in Belarus like in Ukraine, because they have democracy. There are several fake candidates in Belarus, and their aim is to create an illusion of a choice, but there are no elections in Belarus. Some of fake candidates, they openly say that their aim is not to win the elections for them, but to support Lukashenko.
Lukashenko Alexander Grigorievich.
January 26 would be the first elections in Belarusian history completely without the monitoring or observation of independent media inside Belarus. All independent medias, Belarusian independent medias, they are working abroad. It is the first situation in history. The whole landscape, media landscape in Belarus, is controlled by pro-Lukashenko and pro-Putin media. Independent Belarusian media working for Belarusian audience, we have only possibility to reach them via satellite or with internet. There is a total control over the media in Belarus. Lukashenko himself and his ministers, they are just appointing the heads of medias in Belarus.
Период независимости мы занимались недостаточно. Не надейтесь, мы никогда не повторим половины.
Could you provide examples of similar propaganda playing out in other countries?
The Lukashenko's regime propaganda of intimidating voters with war before the elections is very similar to the tactics of pro-Russian Georgian Dream Party before the elections a few months ago. Similarly to Lukashenko, Georgian Dream said that if you vote for us, there will be peace. But if you vote for our opponents, for the opposition, there might be war like in Ukraine.
Elections are usually a democratic process in which citizens vote for various candidates, except when they aren't. Belarus just held a sham presidential election. Alexander Lukashenko, a close ally of Vladimir Putin's, has remained in power in Belarus since 1994. My next guest is here to talk about Sunday's so-called elections and whether he thinks democracy can prevail in Belarus.
Anatol Kotau, International Relations Manager, Belarusian Sports Solidarity Foundation. He has over 2 decades of experience in international relations, public administration, and political advocacy. He served in senior roles within Belarus's government, including positions in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the National Olympic Committee, and the Presidential Administration Office, before joining the opposition following the 2020 presidential election.
Anatol, thank you so much for joining us, and we're going to be talking about the elections, or the scam elections, as they've been called by Maria Callas, in Belarus.
Yeah, it's difficult to call this process elections at all, and even the scam elections is some sort of exaggeration to what we have witnessed a couple of days ago in Belarus.
Because democratic processes are basically processes where the people are electing someone and voting.
Yeah, that's true. And when there is an ability to witness this, to observe this process with the independent observers coming from abroad, coming from the country, the main body is ODIHR from OSCE, and there was no mission for second time actually at the presidential elections, and all those internal observers and even those who came abroad, they were selected by the state, by the regime. So it's difficult to call this process elections at all.
And in 2022, in the summer, there was a big hope. Belarusians has risen up as they never did before. What happened since this time?
Actually, this shows the big difference between 2020 and 2025, because in 2020 there was an atmosphere and there was a chance for people to participate in this process, and of course those elections were also scammed by the regime. They were staged by the regime, but there was a possibility to have many people at the voting booths, making photos of their bulletins and of their votes, and there was a room for internal observers to count how many people are doing this, because it was still difficult to watch the counting process. But there was a possibility to observe the voting process, and people were marking themselves with white strips or some white cloths, and those people who were voting against Lukashenko, they were doing the photos of their ballots. And in 2025, there was no chance for such actions, because, for example, there were no blinds at the voting booths, and it was impossible, it was forbidden to do even a photo of your vote, of your bulletin, and those who were doing so were also repressed, and in 2025. That's why in 2020 there were crowds of people trying to vote and trying to defend their votes. In 2025, empty.
So basically all the major values of democratic processes have disappeared this year. There was basically no free elections, as you were saying, but there was also a state propaganda that was even stronger than before since 2020.
Yeah, that's true. The propaganda also has taken their lessons learned from 2020, and since the very beginning of this process, they were just putting a pressure on people to go to the voting booths and to vote for Lukashenko. And the main thing for them was to make people go to voting booths, to have this picture of crowds of people voting for participating in these staged elections.
So there was the major narrative before the election, or were there also some narratives that have been used as the state propaganda, disinformation, to influence people?
There were, I guess, two narratives. First, that they have an obligation to come and vote, and the second main narrative was that those who are trying to be an opposition, those who are trying to say something within this campaign, they should be inside the country. And propaganda was totally silent on the issue what has happened to those people who dared to do so in 2020. They either in jail, either in prison, and on the after elections press conference, actually, the elections was going on and Lukashenko was delivering his press conference, he said that is democracy, that is the freedom of choice. You can go to jail or you can go abroad. It's up to you.
State violence being used as a statement of democracy.
Yeah.
And does people that still live in Belarus believe that they live in democracy?
For sure not. For sure not. The hope for democracy, the hope for change was real in 2010 and in 2020. In 2025, there is no room for even illusion of democracy in Belarus.
Do you think that there is a chance that Belarus will be free?
I know that Belarus will be free one day, but it's not only about Belarusian people themselves. It's also about the more decisiveness on the side of Western countries. And we know that Russia should be defeated, or Russia at least should be weakened after this bloody war they are conducting against Ukraine, and after all the actions they done to threaten, to undermine European safety and security.
And they also brought a big polarization in between Belarus and Ukraine.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Of course, it doesn't look like in Russia. There are almost no Belarusians who are, I would say, hate Ukrainians for those that they do not want to be a part of Russian sphere of control, that they are fighting for democracy since 2014, because the war actually against Ukraine had started in 2014 after the, I would say, first elections in Ukraine, which dissatisfied Russia.
Freedom of media in Belarus is not existing, is the illusion. How about social media? Are there any ways to contact the citizens living in Belarus?
Of course, internet or social media based on internet solution or satellite, they are means to communicate with people inside the Belarus. But we have to admit that the influence of such media who are operating from abroad is a little bit weaker than in comparison to day-to-day propaganda from each and every TV which is located in your home. You are being prosecuted in Belarus for some subscriptions for any media other than state media, because almost all independent media are on the list of so-called extremist or terrorist materials. So it's not allowed to have even subscription, because there is a criminal responsibility for that. And of course, when the journalists do not have a day-to-day contact with the people from inside the country, they are from day to day they are losing these grounds, they are losing these connections, they are not so close to people, they are not able to perform like a real journalist, and that's why people are trying to not to watch state propaganda, but on the other hand, the interest in independent media is also weakened.
And without having access to other information, it's hard to have a vision of the world that is different than the one of Lukashenko.
Yeah, that's true.
Thank you so much for joining us and talking about the situation in Belarus.
You're welcome.
Now, let's look at the definition of state propaganda.
What is state propaganda, and how does it tie back to disinformation techniques? State propaganda refers to the purposeful and systematic dissemination of information, ideas, or narratives by a government to influence public opinion in favor of its political agenda or ideology. State propaganda is often designed to spread biased or misleading information, such as half-truths, exaggerations, or outright lies, designed to evoke emotional responses. Disinformation is the enabler of state propaganda, with the most common techniques used including simplifying information, appealing to emotional emotions like fear or hope, and discrediting opposing viewpoints.
As Churchill said, democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those others that have been tried. To this day, it remains a political system rooted in values such as equality, freedom of choice, and civic participation. But many countries around the world are witnessing democratic backsliding. I always wonder why people have a tendency to embrace more arbitrary and repressive regimes. Perhaps it gives them a false sense of safety and the illusion of choice. In a world where we don't know what's real anymore, we need to remember that our emotions are very real.